right? So one of the things that I go through in the book, and this is one of the earlier lessons in the book, is there are three really kinds of disagreements. The first is a disagreement about fact, which usually takes the form X is Y, where X and Y are objective features of the world. So the school has a playground, right? There's an answer to that. There could be a second kind of disagreement, which is a disagreement about judgment, which usually takes the form A should be considered B, where B is a kind of a normative or a moral judgment. So the health of the public school system should be considered our responsibility or not. And in addition to that, there's this third kind of disagreement, which is about prescription. So C should D, where C is a kind of an actor and D is an action. So we, parents, should send our kids to the local public or government school. And within any given argument, all of those things tend to coexist. They tend to be bubbling and they come to surface at different times. And that's important, as I say, to avoid misunderstanding. It's important to name the dispute, but the other more personally important thing about this lesson for me was when you specify what an argument is about, you also say what it's not about, right? So when you say our disagreement is just about what that school is like or what our kids are like, certain things get taken off the table, right? It's not about whether we love each other. It's not about your personality. It's not about whether you're a good person or a bad person. And for me, put in this situation where a lot of my differences and my kind of clashes with my peers felt threatening, being in a space where you knew the kind of conversation you were having and what was on and off the table was helpful for me. So I'm just gonna, I'll bring the PowerPoint in and out. So the first thing that I learned, and this was even before I stepped into a debate round, was that every disagreement should start with some agreement, both about how we're going to have the conversation and what we're actually disagreeing about. So then comes the day of my first debate, and this was in year 5, and it was in a school auditorium in suburban Sydney, very leafy, called the Bush School. It was kind of, you know, a school overrun by the landscape, and you know, it's a kind of a muggy space. There's a corrugated iron roof, and you can hear the rain coming down, and it's forming a drum. And you go up, and the topic is that we should ban all zoos. And I'm the first affirmative speaker for this topic. And I felt myself become very visible. Whereas on the playground, in the pickup area after school, you can kind of slide by unnoticed, and maybe that's the point. But when a moderator announces your name, and everybody knows the rule is you don't talk when this person is about to talk, you feel yourself very much in the headlights. And for a while, I couldn't get out the words, but when I did, I started to see lots of subtle movements in the audience. And those are movements like the wince at the corner of people's eye, or the way in which people unfold their arms, or they turn to the person next to them and say, are you hearing this? And in those small moments and in those subtle movements, I started to think that what had previously seemed like very hard and frozen surfaces. And one experience of immigrating for me was feeling like everything else was fixed and I would have to fit myself around it. I started thinking maybe you could, through the power of language and through speech, through argument, you could start to change things as well. That it wasn't just a case of you having to fit yourself around your surroundings, that it could be a give and take. And I've moved across many countries now, and I think each time I've had that experience of feeling like I'll just learn the local ways. I'll read the local restaurant reviews and give my patronage as is recommended, as is required. But there does come a moment when you start to think, I can change things too, that it can be a conversation. And that was that moment for me. So that feeling got me addicted on this activity. And starting from year 5, I started debating for my school debating team. And then I was selected for to represent my state, which was New South Wales, which is the state where Sydney is in Australia. And then onwards to the Australian team. And then when I moved to Harvard for university, the Harvard team. And all throughout that process, I learned that debating as a community, a small subculture, keeping the flames of this activity alive, had developed an incredible database of knowledge, of how-tos, of practical advice that gets filtered down through coaches, through debate societies, debate clubs, and ultimately sharpened, because in debating, you don't have the luxury really of just theorizing, because you have to be able to use the information, right? And whoever has more information and uses it within the context of a debate, the more likely they are to get ahead and to gain some kind of competitive advantage. So I'll share a second lesson with you now to give you a sense of what some of those lessons that I took away from debating is. So the second lesson I thought I might share with you is that in a disagreement, you have to make arguments. And as I said right at the beginning of our time together, the term disagreement is kind of funny because it has so many different meanings. It can describe a passive state of disagreement where we just don't see eye to eye. It can describe a kind of a diffuse conflict. And it can also refer to the action of disagreeing, right? And the craft and the work that involves. An argument is not just any set of remarks that vaguely supports your view. It's not just emoting. It's not just a repetition of your position. It's a kind of a tool that we have of making our thoughts not only legible to the other person, but accountable to them too. Right? So arguments conform to a set of rules that we as a community and as a society have been able to come up with to say, this is how we're going to try and convince one another how we're going to present our ideas to each other so that we can understand where it is that you're coming from, but also to verify, to check, to compare. And so there's that strong accountability component to it too. So in debating, we make a kind of a craft out of it. And this came out of my attempts, which I write about in the book, to try and be really good at this. And one of the things that you learn as you're coming up is you're at a disadvantage with age in the debating world. And the reason is, in any given debate, you're writing 4 substantive arguments, probably, at least. And if you do that week in, week out, including the training sessions, you get an advantage of hundreds, if not thousands, of arguments over people who are a couple or several years younger than you. And I had this thought that maybe the way in which I'm going to get better at it is by writing out a bunch of arguments, that I would be able to outpace people with the work, which is a very healthy mindset for a teenager, but it's the one I had. And I learned there was some precedent for this, actually, that the ancient Greeks had this term, the progymnasmata, which was a set of written exercises that people would do before you earn the right to present your ideas in the public square, right? That they had these kind of quite prescriptive scaffolds almost for how to construct an argument. And people would used to practice just by writing it through. So I was playing around with this idea, and in the book I present similar drills. But today I thought I'd start by just sharing the beginning place of understanding what an argument is that's distinct from just a random grab bag of thoughts. And that's by asking, what do we want our argument to do for us? What do we want our argument to do for us? So here again, I'll take some suggestions and input. So I think we were saying the chat box is not working. So try and put some answers in the Q&A box. So imagine if you're making the argument that we should be vegetarian because eating meat is bad for the environment. We should be vegetarian because eating meat is bad for the environment, right? So the question is, what do we have to prove in order to persuade the listener of this argument? What do you think we have to do to try and persuade the listener of this argument? So put down some thoughts in the box, and I'll share them. So what do we have to do to persuade a listener of this? So 2 ways in which you can think about it is, one is, imagine if you're making this argument, you really want to convince someone of this argument. What do you think you're going to have to do to persuade them? And you can also get at it from the listener's perspective. If someone is trying to persuade you of this, and think about maybe whether you eat meat right now or not, what are they going to have to prove to you to drill home this argument, to make it persuasive for you? Great. We're starting to get some suggestions. Thank you. And if you're noticing that your mind is kind of a bit of a swirling with lots of ideas of, maybe studies that you've read, or even an image from Peter or something that you've come across, that is useful to note. So when we are coming up with an argument, our mind often is just a storm of associations even. And part of the work that we're trying to do when we come up with an argument is to give them some shape, and to give them some form. So these are terrific suggestions. So Anne says, our meat consumption is negatively affecting the environment, right? So pretty straightforward. So the argument is that we should be vegetarian because eating meat is bad for the environment. And probably the first thing you're wondering is it bad for the environment? Right? And so one of the things you need to do in the argument is to actually show that there are these environmental consequences that you're talking about. Now, Freeman, I apologize if I'm mispronouncing that, raises a different point, which is this point about what about financial cost? Now, that is external to this point about the environment, right? It's not really a point about whether it's good or bad for the environment, but it matters because in order to persuade this person, you're going to have to persuade them that this concern about the environment should take some precedence over other concerns you might have regarding financial cost. It might be you just really like it. It might be your some cultural practices that you engage in require it or have historically involved the eating of meat. And so you need to explain that the concern for the environment should take some kind of precedence. So the basic structure of an argument is we start by saying, well, what is it that you want to convince the other side of? That's the conclusion that you're drawing. And what's the main claim that you're going to make to support that conclusion? So we should be vegetarian because eating meat is bad for the environment. And the two things that you're going to have to do are exactly the ones that Anne and Freeman identified, which is you're going to have to explain that your main claim is actually true. So eating meat is in fact bad for the environment, because if it's not, then you don't really have any legs to stand on. But second, you're going to have to explain why the fact that eating meat is bad for the environment means we should be vegetarian. So why does the main claim being true mean that we have to reach the conclusion that you've reached, as opposed to saying, yeah, it is bad for the environment, but it would be too expensive for me, as Freeman says, to make the adjustment, or it would be bad for my health because I don't think I would get enough iron or whatever the other arguments might be. So this is what we call in debating the two basic burdens of any argument, and that is to show that it is true and that it's important. And in the book, I go through a series of exercises and provide some advice on how we might go about meeting those burdens. And key to that is that every argument should answer the 4 W's. What's the argument about? Why is it true? When has it happened before? So is there an example or a case study? And who cares? Right? And that's the point about importance. Why does the argument matter? Why is it enough for us, or enough of a reason for us to change our view?